So I'm finally going to do it. I've been thinking about this for 8 months. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do a full lore breakdown video, including some of the other headcanon that I never actually finished and actually put it in a video. So the reason why we're starting back with this series is because this is the origin point. This is kind of what made everything like plausible in the first place. Now, the reason why this particular build is actually really important is because this was the reason, the thing that allowed the rest of it to actually exist. What I like to do is make environments where multiple people can walk through and have their own idea of what actually happened here. I have my own headcanon, but it allows people that expression and imagination and sense of self to decide what happened where and what have you. Now, what I'm creating here is the desolation of an after battle that happened a millennial or so ago. It's like a long time ago. And this is important, as you'll see why here in a little bit. So this isn't the exact same video. It's about 4 or 5 minutes later. I'm talking about the remnants of the encampment that was the group that laid siege to the city that is now completely desolated when suddenly there's a meteor strike that happens. This is my first attempt at any kind of special effects at all. I had no concept of how to use chroma key. It was not great. The shake effect was something I did manually. It took forever. So here I'm panicking because I'm like, I realize there's something is very wrong and I get to get out, and the nether portal is broken. I'm like, well, I don't have time to fix this. Pieces are missing. I've just got to go. The closest thing I've got is the end. So I turn and run to the end. And this is where this video takes a pretty interesting turn. The next 4 or 5 scenes actually take place on 3 or 4 different servers. This is on a green screen back end. This is on a test world where I used a mod called Draconic Evolution that has a reactor that if you blow it up, it explodes and it does this effect. So what you just saw blow up was actually a backup of the actual world. This is a super flat world that I superimposed the explosion on top of. And this is a still of a different world. Now this is on a backup of the world, this part right here. And it completely just wipes everything out. Now, something to note is as I'm flying to the end portal, the screen fades out and there's the transition. You don't actually see what happens. And that is something that is kind of important because Enki going forward until much later doesn't know what happened himself. The impact itself is very canonically important, both in terms of size and sheer power. The blast from the impact took out everything from the impact point to just beyond where the portal was that I was running to. Now, if you take the radius and run it all the way around, the blast took out not only spawn, but the shopping district. There's also a handful of communities, some which have 10 to 15 people, but everyone in this area is basically dead. It just so happened that this time I was the only one logged on, and that's very important. I spend the next 10 to 15 seconds just showing the amount of devastation and the fact that entire mountains are missing. And I just wrap up the episode there and just end it. Now, this is a really important piece because it's more than anything else a transition between this world and the next one, both in the literal and metaphorical sense in this scenario. I'm a really big fan of continuity in my storyline. So after I released episode 1 of Autocraft, I went back to Questcraft and built this because I felt like I needed an origin point, and this was definitely it. So after I died, but before I landed on Autocraft, this is what happened. Loki was running for Tyr because he had played a prank on him and Tyr was not happy. He was chasing him down. So Loki was running to Helheim because it was a safe place. There's only a few people that know actually how to navigate the void. Helga, Loki, and Odin. Now, the only reason why Loki knows how to get to Helheim is because Helga is his daughter. His children also include Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, the world serpent, and Fenrir, so he's got some interesting genetics. But basically, Tyr screws up, ends up floating in the void. Loki sees this, sees my body, sees Tyr, goes back, talks to Helga, and Helga's like, well, I don't want them both there. I would take the one, except for I don't know who he is, and he doesn't really belong here anyway. And so she came out with Loki and saw us both. Helga fused his soul into my body, thus changing my skin, and then promptly yeeted me into the void. Oh, and this thing was attached to me too. So let's talk about this thing. This guy, this person, this antagonist wasn't supposed to be here. He ends up being the byproduct of a collaboration I was doing with a former member who just kind of ghosted us and disappeared. But since I introduced him, I needed some way to actually keep him canonically. So I ended up doing some more additional research into Norse mythology and found this race of beings like dark elves that kind of feed or like live in the aether or like in the realms in between realms. Not quite the same as the void in this particular instance, but kind of the same. So the idea that I came up with is, well, if he was there like in a parasitic or amoeba-like state attached to me and then suddenly landed in a world where he could grow, that would be possible. But the idea is that it was attached to me in the same way that Tyr's soul was attached to me. It was kind of embedded inside of my body, and it was there just kind of waiting and growing and learning and biding its time. So that's kind of where that went. Now, the reason why I was floating in the void was because Spawn had been destroyed by that explosion. It basically put the world into shock, and while it was in shock, it prevented me from coming back to life. I'm going to stop talking here for a second and let the dialogue play out. This dialogue here explains why the battlefield I built was so very important.
My axe is yours to command. This is the realm in between. Currently, you are traveling down the rivers of life to a realm new to you. Your mortal life ended quickly on a battlefield to forces that no mere mortal could combat.
Now, in my original notes, this wasn't supposed to be Odin, this was supposed to be Loki. So the way it was supposed to happen was Enki was supposed to fade out, and then Odin was going to fade to Loki, who was then going to fade out. In the end, I decided just to go with it was a cerebral manifestation, because that was easier to explain than trying to incorporate Loki into this already fairly complex story arc that I had written out, and I only had just a rough outline. In the end, I feel like it was actually the right decision to make. I'm glad I didn't do it. A part of me wish I'd come up with an easier way to do it, but doing the whole thing myself, it would have been just too much. I'm going to slow down the next little bit here, because this little sequence here, I think most people actually miss because it happens so fast. And what you're seeing here is the last set of 4 or 5 events that Enki actually remembers before he died. Now, the reason why they're in sepia is because they're effectively being erased. So the first 4 or 5 scenes here is Enki coming to, not really understanding what's going on, not really being him, but also being him. And the fade back and forth, the fuzziness is basically his mind and eyesight are just kind of fighting with each other and coming back through because he's not really had a body in a while. Now, in real time, the way I imagine this is this time period was only about 6 weeks. The way I approached it is the time in the void probably flows a lot differently. So for Enki, he might have been gone for years. I did not actually determine a length. But this was the first scene that I did that made me realize that I kind of wanted to animate this because I like the idea of him picking himself up off the ship and like rubbing his eyes and kind of half falling over and like falling over the edge of the ship into the water. That would have been like some comic relief and pretty true to life if you were that disoriented. I wanted to lean very heavily into a lot of the more of the Nordic Viking lore, and so this here is a classic turf house. And turf houses were built largely out of stone and mud and like wheat thrashings for the rooftop. In some areas, they would embed them and build them into the side of hills and mountains to protect them from the elements. It would add to insulation and help with heating and cooling. It was at this point that I decided to have the 2 entities or 2 minds like start fighting for control. Now, the flashback sequences you're seeing here, the little bits and pieces, I start doing quite a bit. But these ones in particular is the village area that I developed in my previous SMP. So it's the idea that Enki's memories are pushing through into tears. I really liked this glitch effect, and I did it quite a bit. There was a few places that I did it, ended up taking it out afterwards because I felt like it was slightly overkill. I call this Enki starts to have an existential crisis because he doesn't know why he knows what he knows. Now, the interesting thing about this is it was completely ad-libbed. I had no plan on doing this. I just made the boat and then realized that it was recording and I needed to do something about it. And it was all just off the cuff. I think it turned out pretty well.
All right. Well, what's your name?
My name is Enki Enki. Just Enki. This was my initial integration to the world. I needed to meet someone to actually show that there's other people here. Alpen was so gracious enough to lend me her acting talent in a couple different places throughout this thing. Rusty as well was really pivotal in how I ended up wrapping up the series for this season of Autocraft. Now, the reason why I called myself Enki the Red is because that's actually a takeoff of Eric the Red. Now, for those of you who are not historians, Eric the Red was a Viking that was exiled and kicked out of Viking land or Vinland or Yeeland or I forget what it was called, forgive me. But he then went on to sail to find Greenland. And then he tried to market as being better and greener and nicer than Iceland to get other people to settle there. He was kind of a devious character. I needed an antagonist for the story to actually have a conclusion. And so here Enki is finding out that there's a dragon king. Nordic history is full of all kinds of mythical creatures. So this naturally panics him. Now, the interesting thing is the entire first episode and about 3/4 of the second episode was not scripted. I had a brief overview written, and as short of this conversation I had with Alpen, everything was just ad-libbed. I just thought, I'm going to try this, see how it works, and it worked out pretty well. About halfway through the second episode, I came to a few realizations, and that's when I started scripting everything out. And it ended up being a very, very long script over the course of the entire series. A lot of things happened very quickly in episode 2. Autocraft was wrapping up their season fairly soon, and I needed to get through the part I wanted done before the end of the season. So this is much more of a transitional piece, and these episodes, specifically the story-driven ones, were taking quite a bit longer to produce than I had initially anticipated. I was being very, very cautious about what the viewer saw, and I needed to make sure there was some continuity. I needed to be able to justify getting into the nether. So once again, Alpen was more than gracious to help me out with this. I did something very specific with sound between the first and second episode. In the first episode, whenever there was a flashback of memory servants, I added this high-pitched, ear-piercing, squeal, like the type of thing if you have tendinitis. And I did that as an implication of there's something else going on that is causing physical pain. This episode, instead of using that, I used this really heavy heartbeat sound because it felt like it was a lot more threatening at that point. I did all kinds of little mini flashbacks and memory resurgences all over the place, and I did this just to kind of show that Enki's memories are really pushing through. So the idea behind flashbacks like this is to kind of illustrate the fact that he now knows a lot of things about the Nether that he didn't know previously, and it's just kind of recessed into the back of his brain because they're actually Enki's memories. He doesn't understand where they're coming from, at least not yet, and he doesn't really suspect anything is going on. He's just confused. And not just be confused because they're Nether flashbacks, but also confused because he's seeing what happened to him on the previous world, and he's unable to connect the dots because he doesn't understand what it is he's seeing. Now, something I wanted to add but didn't was going to be flashbacks of being in Asgard, but I was having a hard time finding any kind of Minecraft-y builds that would be indicative or anything like that. And I decided just to kind of skip the concept because it would have made some of these episodes even longer to produce, and some of them were already quite time extensive. This is roughly about 5 minutes later in the episode. Now, this is the first time that Enki and Tyr actually split, and this is only accomplished because what Enki has figured out at this point, that if he wears Tyr out and exhausts him, basically he becomes corporeal, and he can actually get out and do things. Now, this was accomplished with 2 accounts on a open-to-land world where I put them in separate teams. That's the only reason why I can't see his name tag and he can't see mine. About 90% of the building and 90% of the stuff that is filmed at night is actually done in a single player world where I can actually turn the day-night cycle off. This was very necessary because there's a couple of scenes where I'm building things, and if suddenly it's daytime, why wouldn't he be awake? And it becomes a continuity issue. So everything that got built that you see also got built in the real world, but it was first built in survival in a single player world. And some things got built 3 or 4 times because I kept screwing something up. I named this episode Brain Hemorrhage because this is where Tyr starts to think he's actually going mad and losing his mind, and his head is constantly in pain all the time because I'm fighting for control. Again, for continuity issues, I actually had to justify being able to getting enchants and wings and things on my gear. So I took over his armor and went to the end and enchanted his stuff for him, and then proceeded to play a prank. Now, the prank was twofold. One, I really, really wanted to prank Rusty. Secondarily, I was using it as an intro line in order to facilitate the ending of the series for this particular season. This, what you're seeing right here, is actually the third ending I recorded. This was the point where I realized I need to script things. And this is when I started documenting everything out. Again, I had an outline of what I wanted, but it was not really any kind of detail. But this is when I realized this was going to go a lot further than I thought it was going to, and I needed to be a lot more detailed and a lot more thorough. Now, if you're paying close attention, this is the point when notice certain things look a little bit different. The dark blocks look normal, the bottom half of the door looks normal, the grass looks normal, the texture pack is kind of falling apart. And what I did is I just swapped out the textures. And this is just a visual indication of he's starting to lose it. And it starts to freak him out, especially when he walks outside of his house and finds that I have left him a note. And then he takes a good look at himself and he panics even more. The server had its own story arc about something called the Dragon King. And the long story short is Rusty was the Dragon King. He was imbued with magical powers and he was going to resurrect the dragon. So Enki comes flying through the area and finds a dragon skeleton and proceeds to freak his crap out because he was told that the dragon was human-sized and now there's enormous skeleton. And what he's built to protect himself is nowhere near sufficient enough. So then he decides he needs to protect himself more by creating a projectile weapon. And because he's like, Norse mythology and medieval, he does the only thing he knows how to make, which is a catapult. Enki, of course, goes, this is stupid. I'm really kind of tired of this game back and forth. And so he proceeds to push him every single night to the brink of just losing his mind. And this is quite deliberate on his part. So the first night, he changes out the catapult for a World War II anti-aircraft cannon, because why not? This is where this episode gets a little bit kind of insane, because night after night, it becomes this competition between Tyr does something and Enki comes out and tops it. And he pushes him to the brink every single time. I mean, at this point, you can imagine Tyr is literally pulling his hair out and afraid to go to sleep because he doesn't know what's going to happen in the morning when he wakes up. If you pay really close attention after every single night where something changes, the texture pack also changes just a little bit. Things start to revert back to a normal vanilla Minecraft rather than using the textures I was using. This has just helped to further facilitate the fact that he's actually losing his mind. Again, all of this is purely intentional on Enki's part because he's trying to break him. Because he needs to break him to confront him. And he manages to successfully do that. But that happens when he flies into town and he sees the prank that I played on Rusty and has memories that it was him. And that's the final key for him. Because now I'm screaming at him in his own memories and he sees this and he's like, that's not me, that's not my fault. That was the final straw that really made him collapse. And it was absolutely necessary. This was the very first animation I ever completed, and it took a long time for how short it is. There isn't very much movement because I found movement really hard, everything's really clunky, it doesn't matter. Anyway, first, rough, difficult, but this is where Enki finally confronts Tyr, and they're separate entities, and what he ends up doing is actually forcing him back to where everything began, to force him to accept certain truths. Now, this is all happening inside of his head. But Tyr doesn't quite understand that. There's actually a point where he calls down help from Thor and a flying lightning axe comes flying out of the sky at him. Enki bats it aside like it's not a big deal. But he also knows that Tyr, before he's going to let go, has to die, quote, in battle because Valhalla. Now, the reason why it was important that the episode went where it does and he passed out where he did is because Rusty was there and he knew Rusty would be kind of upset and maybe slightly aggressive, and it wouldn't take much to provoke Rusty to kill him. Now, if he dies in battle, he can let go because he can go to Valhalla, and that's how this ends. The only reason at the time that I could justify this was because Rusty had an ancient power of the Dragon King. And this becomes very relevant. So I needed him here and I needed Rusty at the end. Otherwise, a lot of things wouldn't make sense because I had to have that thread to pull it completely through. I don't even know that Rusty knew this. Here in my exit monologue, I actually very specifically say the line, I can still feel him there, he's in the back of my head, but he's not a threat anymore. And that's because it didn't feel like this was done. It felt like there was still more life in this, and I wasn't sure where it was going to go at first, and so I left this rather open. And of course, it does carry through into the next season.